They watch me now from their porches, the old women and men of Harmony Creek, their rockers creaking in a slow, judgmental rhythm. They see the ghost I've become, a 70-year-old woman with hair like spun silver and eyes that hold the flat, gray calm of a winter lake. They see me walk the same route every morning, past the town square with its perfectly manicured rose bushes, past the cheerful facade of the refurbished cinema, my gaze always lingering for a moment on the park bench dedicated to a man they called a hero. Alistair Finch Park. The name tastes like rust in my mouth even after all this time. They whisper as I pass. They call me the recluse, the sorrowful spinster who returned to her parents' house to die. They remember a different girl, a phantom from half a century ago, a bright star who vanished from their sky without a trace. They don't connect the two. They don't know that the ghost and the star are one and the same, and that I didn't return here to die. I returned to watch and to wait. Because every third Tuesday, another man, a figure just as celebrated, drives his polished sedan down Main Street. He's stooped now, his movements slow and pained, but the town still parts for him like the sea for a prophet. Marcus Thorne. Their beloved Mr. Thorne. And when he passes, he sometimes glances towards my little house on the corner, a flicker of something unreadable in his watery eyes. He doesn't know I see him. He doesn't know I remember everything. He thinks the past is buried, that its bones have turned to dust. But he's wrong. The past isn't dead. It isn't even past. For me, it is the autumn of my senior year, and the air is electric with promise. In that other life, the one before I became a ghost, Harmony Creek felt like a stepping stone, a beautiful, gilded cage I was destined to unlock. The town was nestled in a valley in Oregon, perpetually smelling of damp earth and pine needles. In autumn, a soft, golden light filtered through the turning leaves of the oak and maple trees that lined every street, making the entire town look like a memory, even as you were living it. Life moved with the seasons. Everyone knew everyone else's business, from Mrs. Gable's prize-winning petunias to the latest teenage romance blossoming over milkshakes at Miller's Diner. It was a good place to grow up, everyone said. Safe. Wholesome, a place where nothing truly bad ever happened. I, Lily Hayes, was its star pupil. At 17, my life was a carefully constructed blueprint for escape. My bedroom walls weren't covered in posters of rock stars, but with pennants from Columbia, Yale, and Brown. My nights were spent under the glow of a desk lamp, highlighting textbooks and editing submissions for the Harmony Herald, the school paper I ran with a quiet, fierce pride. I was a girl built of ambition and straight-A report cards. My father, David, worked at the local lumber mill, his hands permanently calloused, his love for me expressed in gruff, proud pats on the back. My mother, Sarah, was a nurse at the small-town clinic, her kindness a soft, warm blanket, though her eyes always held a trace of worry, as if my fierce ambition was a fragile thing she feared would break. They were good people, my parents. They believed in the simple, sturdy values of Harmony Creek. Work hard, be honest, respect your elders, and trust in the systems designed to protect you. They were proud of their brilliant daughter, but they couldn't fully comprehend the hunger that drove me, the desperate need to prove I was more than just a girl from a small Oregon town. I wanted the world. I wanted to write things that mattered, to live in a city where anonymity was a gift, not a curse. Harmony Creek, with its suffocating kindness and predictable rhythms, was the launch pad, not the destination. My sanctuary, the place where my dreams felt most real, was Harmony Creek High School. The long, polished corridors hummed with the energy of 1,000 futures. To most students, it was just school. To me, it was an arsenal. Every book I read, every equation I solved was another weapon in my quest for a scholarship, for a ticket out. I moved through the halls with a purpose that set me apart. Teachers would smile and call out, "Morning, Lily! Another perfect score on the history exam, I see." I'd give them a polite, practiced smile, my mind already on the calculus problems waiting in my next class. I had friends, of course, girls I'd known since kindergarten, but there was always a gentle distance. My focus was a wall they couldn't quite scale. They talked about the homecoming dance and weekend parties. I was diagramming sentences from Faulkner and memorizing French verb conjugations. And then there was Mr. Thorne's class. Room 21B was not like any other classroom at Harmony Creek High. Other rooms smelled of chalk dust and floor wax. Mr. Thorne's room smelled of old paper, leather, and possibility. The walls were lined not with motivational posters, but with framed prints of famous authors and poets, their gazes intense and brooding. It was the only class where the bell signaling the end of the period felt like an intrusion. Mr. Marcus Thorne was the school's crown jewel. He had arrived 5 years earlier from somewhere back east, bringing with him an electrifying passion for literature that was utterly foreign to our small town. He wasn't like the other male teachers, who were mostly paunchy, balding coaches or weary-eyed men counting the days to retirement. Mr. Thorne was dynamic. He had a lean, energetic build, a head of thick, dark hair that was just a little too long, and eyes the color of strong coffee that seemed to see right through you. He didn't lecture from a podium. He prowled the space between the desks, his voice a mesmerizing instrument that could rise to a passionate boom when reciting Whitman, or drop to a conspiratorial whisper when dissecting the symbolism in a single line of poetry. He treated us not as children to be lectured, but as fellow travelers on an intellectual journey. He challenged us, provoked us, and most intoxicatingly, he listened to us. Boys who usually slouched in the back of the room, their minds on football or cars, would lean forward at their desks, caught in the web of his arguments. Girls would blush when his intense gaze fell on them. We were all a little in love with him, in love with the way he made us feel, intelligent, important, capable of greatness, and he had singled me out. It started subtly, a small approving note in red ink at the bottom of an essay. A truly original thought, Lily. See me. A lingering glance during a class discussion, followed by a slow, deliberate nod, as if I had articulated the very point he was about to make. He would use my essays as examples for the class. Listen to this, he'd say, his voice rich with admiration. This is how you dissect a theme. This is how you use language not just to describe, but to evoke. Lily, read the last paragraph for us. My heart would pound in my chest as I read my own words aloud, the praise warming me from the inside out. It was more than just a good grade. It was validation from the one person whose opinion felt like it truly mattered. He wasn't just a teacher. He was a gatekeeper to the world I so desperately wanted to enter. He had been there. He spoke of smoky cafes in Paris and dusty libraries in London as if he had just left them. To have him, this worldly, brilliant man, see something special in me, a girl from a lumber town in Oregon, was a heady, powerful drug. I began to write for him, tailoring my thoughts and my prose to elicit that specific, focused praise. The moment it shifted, the moment the hook was truly set, came on a crisp October afternoon. The air outside was sharp with the smell of burning leaves, and the sunlight slanted through the large classroom windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He had assigned an essay on The Great Gatsby, on the theme of the unattainable dream. I had poured myself into it, writing with a fervor that was almost painful, connecting Gatsby's green light to my own yearning for a life just beyond my reach. The bell rang, shattering the spell of the classroom. Students scraped their chairs back, chattering as they packed their bags, their minds already on the weekend. I was gathering my own books when his voice cut through the noise. Lily, a moment, please. My friends gave me a knowing look and headed out the door. I approached his large oak desk, my heart doing a nervous little flutter. The room was empty now, save for the two of us. The silence felt different, heavier. He was leaning back in his chair, my essay held loosely in one hand, tapping it thoughtfully against his chin. He didn't look at it. He looked at me. This, he said, his voice softer than it was in class, more intimate. This is not a high school paper, Lily. I felt a flush of pride. Thank you, Mr. Thorne. No, you don't understand, he said, leaning forward, placing the essay on the desk between us. He folded his hands on top of it, his gaze holding mine. This is perceptive. It's written with a kind of painful wisdom. You write like someone who understands loss, like someone who understands what it is to want something so badly, it becomes a part of your soul. My breath caught in my throat. He wasn't talking about the grade anymore. He was talking about me. He saw me. All the secret, unnamed longings I poured into my work, the things my own parents couldn't see, he had plucked them from the page and held them up to the light. Your analysis of Fitzgerald, he continued, his voice dropping even lower. It wasn't just good, it was profound. You see the world differently than the others. There's an old soul in you, Lily Hayes. I stood there speechless, clutching my textbooks to my chest like a shield. The air in the room felt thick, charged. The world outside, the noisy hallway, the setting sun, it all faded away. There was only his desk, his intense, admiring gaze, and the feeling of being truly, completely understood for the first time in my life. "We need to work on your college application essays together," he said, his tone now decisive, as if a great plan had just been formed. "A mind like yours can't be left to chance. We have to make sure they see what I see." He smiled, a slow, brilliant smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "This will be our project, just you and me. We'll make you undeniable." I walked out of that classroom floating on a cloud of exhilaration. The hallway seemed brighter, the faces of my fellow students less significant. I had been chosen. I had been seen. A secret, special project. Just him and me. My future, which had once been a distant, hazy dream, now felt solid, tangible, and it was being handed to me by the most brilliant man I had ever known. I didn't recognize the feeling for what it was. I didn't see the careful, patient hand of a predator laying his trap. I didn't understand that he wasn't admiring my soul. He was measuring the walls of my cage. I only knew that the star of Harmony Creek was finally about to get everything she had ever wanted. And as I stepped out into the crisp autumn air, I felt for the first time truly special. It was the most dangerous feeling in the world. The special project, as he had called it, began the following Tuesday. I told my parents over dinner on Monday night, my voice carefully casual as I passed the mashed potatoes to my father. "Mr. Thorne wants to work with me after school on my college essays," I announced. "He thinks I have a good shot at the Ivy League if we really polish them." My father, who had been mid-chew, stopped and looked at me, his fork hovering. A slow, wide grin spread across his face, crinkling the tired lines around his eyes. "Mr. Thorne? Marcus Thorne himself?" he boomed, his voice full of awe. "Well, I'll be. He's the best teacher they've got over there. Must think the world of you, Lilybug." My mother placed her hand over mine on the checkered tablecloth, her touch warm and reassuring. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful. That's just wonderful. See, David?" I told you she was special. Her pride was a tangible thing, a warm glow that filled our small kitchen. In their eyes, the situation was simple. The town's most respected educator had recognized their daughter's brilliance. It was a validation of their hopes, a confirmation of my destiny. Their uncomplicated happiness unknowingly cemented the legitimacy of the entire arrangement, sweeping away any fledgling doubts I might have had. I was doing the right thing. I was making them proud. The next day, when the final bell shrilled through the school, I felt a nervous flutter in my stomach. Instead of joining the river of students flowing out into the afternoon, I turned and walked back down the now quiet hallway to room 21B. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out. I pushed it open gently. Mr. Thorne was at his desk, marking papers, a pair of reading glasses perched on his nose. The room was transformed by the silence. Without the energy of 30 students, it felt less like a classroom and more like a private study, a scholar's sanctuary. He looked up as I entered, and a smile touched his lips. He took off his glasses and gestured to the chair beside his desk. Not one of the student desks, but the wooden visitor's chair, placing me immediately on a different footing, as an equal. "Lily." "Punctual as ever, I like that," he said. "Come sit." "Let's build your future." For the first hour, it was exactly what I had hoped for. It was magnificent. He took my first draft of a personal essay and dissected it with the precision of a surgeon. He showed me where my language was cliché, where my arguments were weak, and most importantly, where a flicker of a truly unique idea was hiding, waiting to be coaxed out. He didn't give me the answers. He asked questions that forced me to find them myself. "You wrote here that you want to make a difference," he said, tapping the page with his pen. "Every single applicant writes that, Lily. It's meaningless. What does it mean to you?" "Forget the admissions committee. Tell me, what is the fire in your belly that makes you stay up all night reading when your friends are at the movies. I found myself talking, really talking, about the restless feeling I always had, the sense of a world so much bigger than Harmony Creek. I spoke of my desire not just to see it, but to capture it in words, to make sense of its chaos. He listened with an unnerving stillness, his eyes never leaving my face. He made me feel like the most interesting person in the world. By the end of that first session, my flimsy essay had the beginnings of a real spine. I left his classroom feeling invigorated, my mind buzzing with ideas. The shift came during our third meeting. We were deep in a discussion about a supplemental essay prompt regarding a significant challenge I had overcome. I was talking about the difficulty of being taken seriously as the editor of the school paper, of managing my peers. He was listening intently, and then he sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to come from somewhere far away. He ran a hand through his thick hair and leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window. "It's refreshing, you know," he said, his voice quiet, talking to someone with a real spark, a real passion. Someone who fights for things. He turned his gaze back to me. "My wife, Eleanor. She's a wonderful woman, a good person, but she doesn't understand this world. The world of ideas, of ambition. To her, a book is just a book. My work is just a job." He gave a small, sad smile. "Sometimes this town, this life, can feel incredibly lonely." The confession hung in the air between us, startlingly intimate. It was the first crack in the polished armor of the brilliant Mr. Thorne. Suddenly, he wasn't just my mentor, he was a person with vulnerabilities, with a sadness that I, somehow, was privy to. A wave of sympathy washed over me, mingled with a strange sense of pride. He was confiding in me. I murmured something inadequate, something about how that must be difficult. He waved it away, but the damage was done. The dynamic had been permanently altered. "It's nothing," he said, forcing a brighter tone. "Let's get back to you. The future mayor of New York City doesn't have time for the musings of a tired old teacher." But it wasn't nothing. After that day, our sessions began to change. The time we spent on my essays grew shorter, and the time we spent just talking grew longer. He would share stories of his life before Harmony Creek, painting pictures of his lonely intellectual struggles at his own prestigious university. He spoke of feeling like an outsider, of being misunderstood by his family, of having dreams that felt too big for the world he was in. He was, I realized with a jolt, describing my own life back to me. He was creating a bridge between his past and my present, making it seem like we were two rare souls cut from the same cloth, born in different generations. The physical boundaries began to blur as well, in ways so subtle I could dismiss each one as an accident or an overreaction on my part. When he leaned over my shoulder to look at a sentence, his hand would rest on the back of my chair, his knuckles sometimes brushing against my hair. The first time it happened, a jolt went through me, an electric shock of alarm. But he pulled away so quickly, his focus so entirely on the words on the page, that I instantly chided myself. "It was nothing. You're being ridiculous." "He's just trying to see." Another time, as he was explaining a complex idea, he reached across the desk and tapped my hand to emphasize a point. His touch was light, dry, and over in a second, but it left my skin tingling. He's a passionate teacher, that's all. He gets excited. His chair seemed to get closer with every session. The space between us, once a formal territory, was shrinking, and with each tiny, deniable trespass, my internal alarms grew fainter, my rationalizations stronger. This was what mentorship was like on a higher level, I told myself. This was the easy camaraderie of intellectual peers. The isolation came next, and it was the most insidious tactic of all. One Friday, my friend Sarah bounced up to me at my locker, her face bright with excitement. "Lily, we're all going to Miller's after the football game tonight. Even Mark Peters is going to be there, and I think he likes you," she whispered, wiggling her eyebrows. A few weeks ago, I would have been thrilled, but a familiar sense of obligation, now tinged with a feeling of superiority, settled in my stomach. "I can't," I said, my voice flatter than I intended. "I have a session with Mr. Thorne." Sarah's face fell. "Again." "Lily, you're with him like 3 times a week. It's Friday night. It's important, Sarah," I said. a defensive edge to my tone. My future is kind of riding on this. Okay, she said, drawing the word out, a hint of hurt in her eyes. Well, have fun with your future. She turned and walked away, joining a laughing group of our friends down the hall. I felt a sharp pang of loneliness watching them go, a longing for that simple, uncomplicated fun. I mentioned it to Mr. Thorne later, a brief, casual complaint about my friends not understanding the pressure I was under. His reaction was exactly what I needed to hear. He chuckled softly. "Let them have their football games and their milkshakes, Lily," he said, his voice a warm, conspiratorial murmur. "That's their world. It's small. What we're doing here, this is building a real life. In 5 years, you'll be walking the halls of a great university, and they'll still be here. This work is what separates you from them." His words were a balm, soothing the sting of my self-imposed exile. He was right. What was one missed night at a diner compared to a lifetime of success? My friends were a part of the world I was trying to leave. Mr. Thorne was my guide to the one I was trying to enter. My loyalty shifted, hardening around him and our project. Our last session before the Thanksgiving break ended late. The sky outside was a deep, bruised purple, and the only light in the room came from the small lamp on his desk, creating an intimate circle of light around us. He had been quiet for a few moments, simply looking at me. "You're making incredible progress," he said finally. "You absorb everything. It's a gift." He reached down into the leather satchel at his feet and pulled out a worn paperback book. He slid it across the desk to me. The cover was plain, the author's name one I didn't recognize, Anais Nin. "This is from my personal collection," he said. "It's for a more mature reader. It's about a woman discovering her own mind, her own passions. I think you're ready for it." He gave me a slow, meaningful look. "Don't tell your parents you're reading this. Or your little friends. This is just for us. A little secret." I picked up the book. It felt warm, illicit. A secret. The word sent a thrill through me, a dangerous, exciting current. It was a confirmation of our special bond, a world created just for two, with its own rules and its own forbidden knowledge. Walking home in the chilly November dark, I clutched the book to my chest. The familiar streets of Harmony Creek seemed different, alien. I was no longer just Lily Hayes, the star pupil. I was a keeper of secrets, a confidant to a brilliant, lonely man. I was on the inside of a hidden world. The mentor's shadow had fallen over me completely, but from where I stood, deep within its embrace, it felt not like darkness, but like the most wonderful, illuminating light. I had never felt so smart, so special, or so completely, utterly blind. The world I returned to after the Thanksgiving holiday was subtly, yet irrevocably, altered. I had devoured Anais Nin's words in the secrecy of my bedroom, the book hidden under my mattress like a religious relic. It spoke of a world of senses, of passions that defied neat categorization, of women who lived by their own emotional and intellectual compass. The book didn't give me answers. It gave me 1,000 new questions and a shimmering, dangerous vocabulary for feelings I hadn't known I possessed. I felt older, as if I had lived a whole other life between its pages. The innocent ambition of the girl I had been just weeks before seemed touchingly naive. When I walked into room 21B for our next session, the air was different. Mr. Thorne's gaze held a new weight, a new meaning. He knew I had crossed a threshold. "So," he said, foregoing any talk of essays, "what did you think of our little secret?" "It was complicated," I managed, my voice barely a whisper. "The best things in life are," he said with a soft smile. "It takes courage to appreciate complexity, Lily. Most people run from it." He praised my understanding of the text, my grasp of its nuances. He called me his protégé, his intellectual contemporary. Each word of praise was a silken thread, binding me tighter to him, making me feel more and more estranged from the simple, black-and-white world outside his classroom door. The sessions bled into December. The pretense of college essays was now a thin veneer, a plausible excuse for my parents. In reality, we spoke of art, of life, of the stifling nature of convention. He was carefully, methodically dismantling the moral framework I had grown up with, replacing it with a new, more fluid ideology where the only true sin was mediocrity, the only true law a connection between two elevated souls. The day it happened, a cold, gray rain was lashing against the tall classroom windows, encasing us in a world of muted light and drumming water. The rest of the school had emptied out quickly, eager to escape the weather. The hallways were silent. The building felt like a tomb, except for this one room, our room, which felt like the only living place on earth. We weren't even at his desk. We were standing by the window, watching the rain slant down, blurring the world outside into an impressionist painting. He had been reading a poem to me, something by a poet I'd never heard of, his voice a low murmur against the rhythm of the storm. The poem was about a love so powerful it was a form of sacrilege, a holy transgression. When he finished, he didn't move. He just stood beside me, the book held loosely in his hand. "You see, Lily?" he whispered. His breath was warm, smelling faintly of coffee. "This is what the great artists understand. This is the truth that lesser people, people who live by timid rules, will never grasp. A connection like ours, it doesn't fit into the neat little boxes that people like your parents or a man like Principal Finch can comprehend. It's rarer than that. It's more profound." He turned to face me. The space between us was gone. He was so close I could see the flecks of gold in his coffee-colored eyes. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. A primal alarm bell was screaming in the deepest part of my mind, but its sound was muffled by the layers of admiration and trust I had so carefully built. "This is wrong," I managed to say, the words feeling foreign and flimsy in my mouth. A look of deep, theatrical sadness crossed his face. "Wrong." "No, Lily. Don't use their words. Don't retreat into their small, safe world now." "Not you. I thought you were braver than that." His voice was a gentle rebuke, laced with disappointment. And that disappointment was a weapon aimed directly at my heart. The fear of losing his esteem, of proving myself to be just another conventional girl, was more terrifying in that moment than the alarm bells. He reached up and his fingers, surprisingly cool, brushed a strand of hair from my cheek. "Don't be afraid of this," he murmured, his eyes holding mine, willing me to believe him. "This is beauty. This is trust. This is the lesson all the books have been trying to teach you. You are a brilliant, beautiful woman, Lily. And this is our secret, our beautiful private world." He leaned in, and the world fractured. My mind detached, floating up to a corner of the ceiling, watching the scene as if it were a movie. I saw a girl who looked like me, her body rigid with a fear she couldn't name, her eyes wide and staring at the rain-streaked window. I saw a man, her teacher, her mentor, his face a mask of gentle, loving concern as he broke every rule, every trust, every sacred boundary that was supposed to keep her safe. The methodical tick-tock of the large clock on the wall became a deafening drumbeat, counting out the seconds of my undoing. I felt the scratchy wool of his tweed jacket against my skin, smelled the chalk dust and his cologne, but none of it felt real. It was the ultimate lesson, the one he had been preparing me for all along. It was a lesson in power, in submission, and in the complete and utter annihilation of the girl I had been. When it was over, the silence that fell was more violent than any scream. The clock ticked on. The rain still fell. He stepped back, and his expression was one of calm, serene satisfaction. He straightened his tie, a small, normalizing gesture that was somehow the most obscene part of it all. "Our secret," he said, and he smiled at me. It was the same smile he gave me in class when I'd made a particularly insightful point, a smile of approval. I couldn't speak. My throat was sealed shut. I gathered my books, my movements clumsy and robotic. I walked out of the classroom, out of the school, and into the cold, cleansing rain. I didn't run. I walked mechanically, letting the water soak my hair, my clothes, my skin, as if it could wash away the filth I felt clinging to my soul. The world looked the same, the wet pavement, the glowing windows of houses, the passing cars, but it was all a lie. The foundational truth of my life, that I was safe, that I was smart, that I was in control, had been systematically dismantled and burned to ash. In the days that followed, I became a ghost in my own life. Sleep offered no escape. I was haunted by the smell of his coffee and wool scent, the sound of the ticking clock. At school, I moved through the hallways in a fog of anxiety. Every corner I turned, I feared I would see him. And when I did, in class, he would act as if nothing had changed. He would lecture on Thoreau or Dickinson, and occasionally his eyes would find mine, and he would give me that small, knowing, gentle smile. It was a brand on my skin, a claim of ownership. It made bile rise in my throat. My grades, once my armor and my pride, began to crumble. I would stare at the pages of my textbooks, but the words would swim and refuse to make sense. My mind, once my sharpest tool, was now a swamp of shame, confusion, and a terrifying, twisted loyalty. His words echoed in the silence of my room at night. A beautiful secret. Two special souls. A part of me, a desperate, terrified part, clung to those words, because if it wasn't a beautiful secret, then what was it? If he wasn't a brilliant, misunderstood soul, then what was he? The answer was a word so monstrous my mind refused to form it. To admit he was a monster was to admit that I, the star pupil, the girl who saw everything, had been the biggest fool of all. So I lived in the terrible twilight he had created, a place where admiration was indistinguishable from fear, and where a secret was eating me alive. The first public crack appeared in Mr. Henderson's calculus class a week later. The room was stuffy and warm, filled with the scratching of pencils. Mr. Henderson, a kind, balding man with a gentle voice, drew a complex equation on the blackboard. "All right, let's see who's been paying attention," he said, scanning the room. His eyes landed on me. "Lily, why don't you walk us through this one?" I looked up at the board. The numbers and symbols, things that had once been a clear and logical language to me, were now just meaningless squiggles. It was like trying to read a language I'd never seen before. My mind was a perfect, silent blank. The scratching of pencils stopped. The silence in the classroom was absolute. 30 pairs of eyes turned to me. I could feel their collective gaze like a physical weight. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. "Lily?" Mr. Henderson prompted, his brow furrowing in concern. I just stared, my heart pounding a sick, slow rhythm. I, Lily Hayes, the girl who always had the answer, had nothing. The star of Harmony Creek had gone dark, and in the suffocating silence of that classroom, I felt the full, crushing weight of my unforgivable lesson, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was completely and utterly alone. The world turned to iron and ice. December bled into a bleak, colorless January. The festive lights and forced cheer of the Christmas holidays had been a special kind of torment, a glittering mockery of the darkness that had taken root inside me. I moved through the family gatherings in a daze, my smile a fragile, painted-on thing. My parents exchanged worried glances over my head. My mother would touch my forehead, asking if I felt unwell. My father would try to joke with me, his attempts falling into a profound, uncomfortable silence. My report card at the end of the semester was a catastrophe of B's and C's, a document so alien, it might as well have belonged to someone else. It was the first concrete evidence of my ruin, and I handed it to my parents with a sense of numb detachment. Their disappointment was a quiet, heavy thing, far worse than any lecture. The sickness began as a whisper, a sour taste in my mouth in the mornings, a rolling unease in my stomach that I attributed to the constant gnawing anxiety. I was exhausted all the time, a deep, cellular weariness that sleep couldn't touch. I would sit in class, the teacher's voice a distant drone, my mind a gray fog. I told myself it was depression. I told myself it was the flu. I told myself it was the physical manifestation of the secret I was carrying, a poison working its way through my system. My body was betraying me, mirroring the betrayal that had shattered my mind. I avoided him. I changed my route between classes to bypass room 21B. On the rare occasions I saw him in the hallway, I would fix my eyes on the floor, my heart seizing in my chest, and hurry past. The special sessions had ended, of course. There was no need for them anymore. The project was complete. The lesson had been taught. The denial held for weeks, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark ocean of truth. But the body does not lie. The body keeps score. The sickness in my stomach grew more persistent. My clothes began to feel tight in a way that had nothing to do with holiday meals. And then, in the stark, unforgiving quiet of a late January night, the ice broke. I was in the small bathroom of our house, the one with the faded floral wallpaper. I had been staring at the calendar, the little red circles I'd made for the last 2 months absent, a glaring omission. The nausea, the exhaustion, the changes I had been so desperate to ignore, they all coalesced into a single, horrifying certainty. I looked at my reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. My face was pale and drawn, my eyes wide with a terror that was ancient and absolute. It wasn't just a secret anymore. It wasn't just a memory. It was a living, growing thing inside of me. It had a presence. It might one day have a heartbeat. The floor seemed to drop away. I gripped the edges of the porcelain sink to keep from collapsing, my knuckles white. The world narrowed to the frantic pounding in my ears and the cold, hard fact that my life, the one I had so carefully planned, was over. The blueprint was ashes. The escape route was gone. I was trapped, not just in Harmony Creek, but inside my own body, a prison that was now shared. Panic gave way to a desperate, illogical scramble for a lifeline. For days I was paralyzed, and then a thought, insidious and born of the very manipulation that had caused this, began to form. He has to help me. The thought was a prayer. He said we were special. He said this was our world. He's a man. He's an adult. He'll know what to do. It was the last, dying gasp of the girl who had believed in him. It wasn't a belief in his goodness, not anymore. It was a belief in his power. He had created this disaster. Surely he held the key to unmake it. He was the only other person on earth who knew the truth. He had to be the solution. It took me another week to build up the courage. I watched his routine, a predator stalking her own creator. I knew he was often the last to leave the school. One Tuesday, as the winter twilight bled across the sky, I waited for him in the teacher's parking lot, hiding between 2 cars, the cold seeping into my bones. The air was still and sharp, and my breath plumed in front of me. Finally, he emerged from a side door, his leather satchel slung over his shoulder. He walked with his usual confident stride, a man at home in his world. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I stepped out from my hiding place as he approached his car. "Mr. Thorne." My voice was a pathetic, trembling thing. He stopped, startled. For a moment, he looked annoyed at the interruption. Then he saw it was me, and the mask of the charming mentor slipped back into place. "Lily," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. "You shouldn't be out in the cold. Is everything all right?" "I've been worried about you. Your grades." "I need to talk to you," I cut in, my words clumsy. "Of course," he said, unlocking his car door. "But I do need to get home. Eleanor is expecting me." He was already dismissing me. "No," I said, a surge of desperate strength propelling me forward. "Please, it's about our secret." The word hung in the cold air between us. The charming smile on his face didn't falter, but something in his eyes went hard and flat. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "What about it?" he asked, his voice losing its warmth. I took a shaky breath. I'm sick, Mr. Thorne. I've been sick for a while." I couldn't bring myself to say the word. I looked down at the frozen asphalt, then back up at him, my eyes pleading. "I think I'm pregnant." The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. The mask didn't just slip, it evaporated. The man standing before me was a stranger, someone I had never seen before. His face, which I had once found so handsome and kind, twisted into a mask of cold, reptilian fury. His eyes, once warm and admiring, were now chips of ice. "What did you just say?" he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "I said I'm pregnant," I repeated, flinching back. "I need your help." "I don't know what to do." He let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor. "My help? Are you insane? He took a step closer, his presence menacing, pinning me against the side of a parked car. You think you can pin this mess on me? You with your little girl fantasies and your melodramatic essays? But it was you, I stammered, my entire world tilting on its axis. Our secret. There is no our secret, he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. There is a troubled, fanciful student who has clearly become delusional. A girl who couldn't handle the pressure and is now looking for someone to blame for her own mistakes. He gestured vaguely back toward the school. I tried to help you, Lily. I gave you my time. I mentored you, and this is how you repay me. With these filthy lies? Each word was a physical blow. He wasn't just denying it. He was rewriting history, painting me as the aggressor, the liar. I have a wife, he hissed, his face close to mine. A life, a reputation in this town. And you think I'm going to let some hysterical little girl destroy all of that with her pathetic, slanderous stories? You are mistaken. He straightened up, adjusting his coat, his composure returning as a cold, polished shell. He looked down at me with utter contempt. This is your problem. You will deal with it, and you will never, ever speak to me about this again. Do you understand? He didn't wait for an answer. He got into his car, started the engine with a roar that seemed to shake the very air, and drove away, his headlights cutting a swath through the darkness. I stood there in the empty, frozen parking lot long after his taillights had disappeared. The cold was so deep it no longer felt like a sensation, but a part of my being. The final, fragile thread of hope had been brutally severed. He wasn't my mentor. He wasn't a complicated soul. He was a monster who had just calmly and deliberately barred the door to his world, leaving me to die in the wilderness he had created. The sickness was real. The consequence was real. And the man who had caused it all had just declared war, leaving me utterly, terrifyingly, and hopelessly alone. For 2 days, I existed in the epicenter of the explosion. The world outside my bedroom window continued. Cars drove by, neighbors collected their mail, the winter sun cast long, weak shadows. But my own world had been reduced to the 4 walls of my room and the roaring silence in my head. Thorne's words echoed, each one a fresh wave of shock that left me breathless. Your problem, filthy lies. Hysterical little girl. He had taken the truth, our shared reality, and twisted it into a weapon against me. The foundation of my sanity felt cracked and unstable. The sickness was a constant, unwelcome companion, a physical reminder of the living consequence inside me. It was a ticking clock, and with every passing hour, my options narrowed. My parents. The thought of telling them now, without any hope of support from the man responsible, was impossible. I could see their faces, crumpled in fear and confusion, their powerlessness a mirror of my own. They would be crushed by the weight of it, and they couldn't fight this. They wouldn't know how. In the depths of that third night, a new, desperate idea surfaced. It wasn't born of hope, but of the absolute absence of it. There was one final authority, one last pillar of the system I had been raised to respect. Principal Alistair Finch. He was the law. He was the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong within the walls of Harmony Creek High. My encounter with Thorne had been a plea to a co-conspirator. This would be different. This would be an appeal to justice itself. The naive girl in me, the one who still believed in rules and order, clung to this last, flimsy branch over the abyss. The system had to work. It was designed to protect students. He was the principal. It was his job. The next morning, I moved like an automaton. I dressed, bypassed breakfast, and walked to school, my stomach a knot of cold dread. The school building, once my sanctuary, now felt like a hostile fortress. Every laughing student, every slamming locker, every cheerful call down the hallway seemed to be part of a world from which I was now irrevocably exiled. My journey to the principal's office was the longest walk of my life. Each step on the polished linoleum floor echoed the finality of my purpose. The outer office was quiet, presided over by his secretary, Mrs. Davison, a woman with a helmet of sprayed gray hair and sharp, suspicious eyes. "Can I help you, dear?" she asked, her tone implying that I was interrupting vital work. "I need to see Principal Finch," I said, my voice thin. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, it's an emergency." She pursed her lips but buzzed his office. "Lily Hayes is here to see you, sir. She says it's an emergency." A muffled voice responded, "Mrs. Davison." Looked back at me. "You can go in." The door was heavy, solid oak, and it swung open into a room that was designed to intimidate. The air smelled of old leather and lemon polish. Dark wood panels lined the walls, swallowing the light from the tall window behind the massive desk. The walls themselves were a shrine to the school's success. Gleaming plaques, framed certificates, and glossy photographs of smiling alumni, doctors, lawyers, athletes, stared down at me. It was a gallery of Harmony Creek's finest products, a silent, powerful testament to the pristine reputation Principal Finch had spent his career building. And there, behind the expanse of his desk, sat the man himself. Alistair Finch was tall and thin, dressed in an immaculate gray suit, his silver hair perfectly combed. He had a long, stern face, and his eyes, behind a pair of silver-rimmed glasses, were a pale, dispassionate blue. He gestured to the hard-backed chair in front of his desk without smiling. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice as crisp and starched as his shirt. "You claim this is an emergency. Please, enlighten me." I sat on the edge of the chair, my hands twisting in my lap. And then I told him. The story tumbled out of me in a broken, tearful whisper. I told him about the special sessions, the manipulation, the things he'd said. I told him about the afternoon in the empty classroom. And finally, my voice cracking, I told him I was pregnant and that Mr. Thorne had threatened me when I'd gone to him for help. Throughout my entire humiliating confession, Principal Finch did not move. He didn't lean forward in sympathy. He didn't offer me a tissue. He didn't take a single note. He simply sat there, his hands steepled under his chin, his pale blue eyes fixed on my face with an unnerving, analytical calm. It wasn't the gaze of a protector or a counselor. It was the gaze of a biologist examining a distasteful specimen under a microscope. When I finished, the silence in the room was absolute, broken only by my own ragged, hitched breaths. He remained still for a long, terrible moment, letting the weight of my words hang in the air and then dissipate, as if they were meaningless. Then, he spoke. His voice was calm, measured, and utterly devoid of any human warmth. "Let me be certain I understand the situation, Miss Hayes," he began, his tone that of a man clarifying a tedious point of fact. "You are alleging that Mr. Marcus Thorne, a man who has been an exemplary and decorated educator at this institution for 5 years, a beloved mentor to hundreds of students, has engaged in an illicit affair with you. And now, upon discovering you are with child, you have decided to attribute your predicament to him." The way he framed it, the clinical dismissive language, made my story sound like a pathetic, sordid fantasy. "It's the truth," I whispered. He ignored me, his gaze unwavering. "So, you have come to me, and you have presented me with a choice. In fact, you have presented yourself with a choice." He leaned forward slightly, the first movement he had made. The intensity in his eyes sharpened, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of something else beneath the calm, a flash of cold, contained fury that was far more terrifying than Thorne's hot-blooded rage. "Here is your choice, Miss Hayes," he said, his voice dropping to a low, chillingly precise level. "Option 1. You walk out of this office. You never speak of this again. To anyone. You handle your situation, privately and discreetly. You will finish the semester as best you can, and no one will be the wiser about this unsubstantiated and deeply damaging fantasy you have concocted." He paused, letting the weight of that offer sink in. "Then there is option 2, he continued, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly. "You can choose to pursue this. You can repeat these accusations outside of this room, and if you do, I will have no choice but to act. I will not only recommend your immediate expulsion for slanderous and malicious accusations against a member of my faculty. I will also personally author a letter that will be sent to every single college to which you have applied. In it, I will detail my grave concerns regarding your moral character and your clear psychological instability. I will make it my personal mission to ensure that the future you have worked so hard for is utterly and completely extinguished. Your life, as you know it, will end." He leaned back in his chair, the threat delivered. He presented it not as a punishment, but as a simple statement of cause and effect. He was the system. I was the error, and he was giving me one chance to delete myself before he was forced to do it for me. "Mr. Thorne is a vital asset to this school and this community," he concluded, his voice returning to its dispassionate tone. "I will not allow his reputation, or the reputation of Harmony Creek High, to be destroyed by a confused, hysterical girl. The choice is yours." I stared at him, my mind reeling. The last vestige of hope, the belief that there was some ultimate justice to appeal to, died a cold and brutal death in that leather-scented office. The system wasn't broken. The system was working perfectly. It was a machine designed to protect itself, and I was a piece of grit in its gears. He had judged me, sentenced me, and offered me the mercy of a silent erasure. I stood up, my legs trembling so badly I could barely support myself. I didn't say another word. There was nothing left to say. I walked out of his office, closing the heavy oak door behind me, the click of the latch sounding like a cell door locking. Mrs. Davison didn't look up from her typewriter. I walked back into the hallway, a ghost drifting through a world that no longer saw me. I was no longer a student. I was no longer Lily Hayes, the star pupil. I was a threat that had been neutralized. A liability that had been contained. The principal's verdict had been delivered, and the sentence was silence. A silence so absolute, so profound, it felt like the end of the world. I don't remember walking home. One moment I was standing in the sterile, echoing hallway outside Principal Finch's office, the click of his door latch sealing my tomb. The next, I was standing on my own front porch, my house key cold and foreign in my trembling hand. The journey between those 2 points is a gray, soundless void in my memory. I had been carrying a secret. Now I was carrying a sentence. Silence. Erasure. The words were a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I moved through the rest of the day like a sleepwalker. I went to my room, lay on my bed, and stared at the ceiling. The familiar patterns in the plaster seemed to shift and writhe. The house was quiet. My father was at the mill, my mother at the clinic. It was the last afternoon of peace that house would ever know. My mother found me like that when she got home. The door creaked open, and she stood there for a moment, her purse still on her shoulder. I didn't turn to look at her, but I felt her presence, her familiar scent of antiseptic soap and gentle concern. "Lily?" she said softly. "You're home early. Are you feeling all right? You look so pale." Her voice, so full of normal, everyday love, was the thing that broke me. It was a sound from a world I no longer belonged to. A choked, guttural sob tore itself from my throat, a sound I didn't recognize as my own. It was the sound of a complete and final unraveling. She was beside me in an instant, her cool hand on my forehead. "Honey, what is it? What's happened?" "Are you sick?" The questions, the kindness, the sheer, terrifying ignorance of my reality opened the floodgates. The secret, the verdict, the entire monstrous truth I had been carrying alone came pouring out. It was not a coherent story. It was a torrent of broken phrases, sobs, and gasps for air. "Mr. Thorne, after school, he said it was a secret. I'm pregnant. Principal Finch, he'll expel me, ruin my life. He said he'd tell the colleges." My mother listened, her hand frozen on my head. Her face, a map of gentle compassion I knew better than my own, went slack with disbelief, then crumpled in horror. Her arms went around me, pulling me into a hug that felt desperate, as if she were trying to physically hold my shattering world together. But I could feel the tremors running through her body. My father came home to that scene, me, hysterical and incoherent in my mother's arms in the fading light of my bedroom. He stood in the doorway, his large frame filling it, his work shirt smudged with sawdust, his face etched with the weariness of a long day. "What in God's name is going on?" My mother, her face streaked with tears, looked at him, and with a few quiet, choked sentences, she relayed the core of the nightmare. I watched the color drain from my father's face. His weary expression was replaced by a dark, thunderous rage I had never seen before. his hands, calloused and strong from a lifetime of labor, clenched into fists at his sides. "That bastard," he growled, the words low and dangerous. "I'll kill him. I'll go over to that school right now, and I will tear him apart." He took a step, his body humming with a primal, protective fury. For a single fleeting moment I felt a flicker of hope. My father, my protector. He would fight for me. "No, David, wait!" my mother cried, grabbing his arm. "Wait!" "There's more. Lily, tell him. Tell him what the principal said." My voice was a raw, shredded whisper. I repeated Finch's threat, the cold, precise words that had been branded into my memory. He said he'd expel me. He said he'd write to every college, tell them I was unstable, that my life would be over. As I spoke, I watched the fire in my father's eyes die. It was like watching a blacksmith quench a red-hot piece of steel in water. The rage hissed and evaporated, replaced by a gray, desolate helplessness. His broad shoulders slumped. He looked from me to my mother, his face a mask of agony. He was David Hayes, a man who worked the saws at the Harmony Creek lumber mill. Who was he against them? Against Marcus Thorne, the town's golden boy, the charismatic intellectual? Against Alistair Finch, a man who sat on the town council, who golfed with the bank manager, the man who held the keys to his daughter's entire future in his hand. He had his fists, but they had the system. It was not a fair fight. It was an execution. That night, the house was filled with a new kind of silence, thick with unspoken terror. I lay in bed, feigning sleep, and listened to them in the kitchen. Their voices were muffled, urgent whispers, a painful symphony of my ruin. "What do we do, Sarah?" My father's voice was ragged with despair. "My God, what do we possibly do? If I go after him, Finch will do exactly what he said he would. He'll destroy her." "I know," my mother whispered back, her voice thick with tears. "But we can't do nothing. Look at her. She's just a child." He called her a liar. They'll all call her a liar. It's her word against a man like Thorne. They'll crucify her. Finch has already promised it. So we let them get away with it? We let him just walk away after what he did to our baby? Is it better to have justice if it means she has no life left? My father's voice cracked on the last word. No college, no future, shamed in this town forever? Is that what you want for her? The conversation went on, a circular, agonizing debate between a father's primal need to protect and a mother's terrified pragmatism. They were talking about damage control. They were talking about survival. They were not talking about fighting. They were not talking about justice. And as I lay there, listening to my parents trying to choose the lesser of two unspeakable paths, a cold, hard layer of ice formed around my heart. I had come to them broken, hoping for warriors, and I had found two more victims. They loved me. I knew they loved me. But their love was a soft, warm blanket when I needed a sword and shield. Their fear, their powerlessness, their whispered practical terror in the face of the institution, it felt like the final betrayal. It was not a malicious abandonment, which would have been easier to understand. It was a surrender, and it left me utterly, completely stranded. The system had threatened me, my abuser had disowned me, and now my family, my only remaining sanctuary, was afraid to fight for me. The home I had grown up in no longer felt safe. It felt like a cage, its walls built not of wood and plaster, but of love and fear, trapping us all in a shared, suffocating silence. The last door in the world had closed, and I was on the wrong side of it, more alone than I had ever thought possible. My home became a museum of unspoken grief. The three of us moved through its rooms like ghosts, haunting the spaces where we had once been a family. Dinners were eaten in a silence so profound I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the scrape of a fork against a plate. My father's eyes were perpetually red-rimmed, his gaze either fixed on his food or darting towards me with a look of such helpless, aching pity that I couldn't bear it. My mother tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, asking about my day in a voice so bright and brittle it threatened to shatter. They were trying to love me, but their love had become a suffocating blanket of sorrow. I was a living tragedy in their midst, and the air in our house was thick with the things we couldn't say. School was a different kind of hell. It was a landscape of my former life, a place where every corner held a memory that now mocked me. I walked the hallways with my gaze fixed on my shoes, my books clutched to my chest like a shield. I felt 1,000 eyes on me, though I knew it was likely just my own paranoia. The whispers of my peers, the normal, cheerful chatter about dates and classes, felt like a language from another world. Mr. Thorne continued to hold court in room 21B, and the sound of his confident, booming voice drifting into the hallway was enough to make my stomach clench with nausea. I was an exile in my own kingdom. There was only one place left to hide: the school library. It was the one corner of the school that demanded silence, a place where solitude was the default state. It was a hushed, orderly world, smelling of old paper, binding glue, and floor wax. The tall, imposing shelves were a forest I could get lost in, the rows of books a silent, unjudging army. Here I could sit in a carrel in the back, hidden from view, and simply not exist for an hour. The library's quiet queen was Mrs. Evelyn Reed. She was a woman who seemed to have faded into the background of the school, as much a fixture as the card catalog. She was nearing retirement, with her silver hair always pulled back in a neat, no-nonsense bun, her uniform a rotation of sensible cardigans over crisp blouses. She moved with a librarian's practiced stealth, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the linoleum floor. Most students barely registered her presence beyond the soft, rhythmic thump-thump of her date stamper. But Mrs. Reed was a watcher. From her perch at the main circulation desk, she saw everything. I knew she had seen me. I had caught her eye a few times, her gaze following me as I made my way to my hiding spot in the history stacks. There was no judgment in her eyes, none of the pity I saw in my mother's or the suspicion I saw in other teachers. There was just a quiet, steady observation, a stillness that was somehow more unnerving than an overt question. My breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was huddled in my usual spot, trying to force myself to read a history chapter, when a group of junior girls settled at a nearby table. Their voices were bright, excited whispers, full of plans for the upcoming prom, dresses, dates, after-parties. The sound of their effortless futures, of a world proceeding exactly as it should, was an unbearable cruelty. Kramchenmestad College. A life. All the things that had been stolen from me in the space of a ticking clock in an empty classroom. A hot, acidic wave of grief and rage washed over me. I stood up abruptly, knocking my chair, and fled deeper into the stacks, to the far back wall where the oldest, most neglected books were kept. It was the dustiest, most forgotten corner of the library. I pressed my forehead against the cool metal of a shelf, my body trembling, and for the first time in this public space, I let the silent tears come. I didn't make a sound, but my shoulders shook with the force of my utter desolation. I didn't hear her approach. One moment I was alone, the next she was simply there. I flinched, turning, my hand flying up to wipe at my wet cheeks, my body tensing for the inevitable, pitying question. "What's wrong, dear?" But Mrs. Reed didn't speak. She didn't touch me. She simply stood there, her expression one of immense, weary calm. In her hands, she held a dusty, brown cardboard box, the kind used for archival storage. She looked at me, and in her pale, faded eyes, I saw not pity, but something that looked like recognition. Without a word, she bent down and placed the heavy box on the bottom shelf beside my feet. I stared at it. Written on the side in faded black marker were the words, Harmony Herald, Archives, 1955, 1965. My brow furrowed in confusion. I looked from the box back up to her face. What was this? She met my gaze, and her voice, when she finally spoke, was so soft it was barely a whisper, a sound meant only for the space between the two of us. "Sometimes," she said, her voice dry as old paper, "the town's memory is longer than people think." She paused, her eyes holding mine with a strange, quiet intensity. "You just have to know where to look." And then, just as silently as she had appeared, she turned and walked away, her soft-soled shoes making no sound, leaving me alone in the dusty aisle. I stared at the box. Old newspapers. What was I supposed to do with old newspapers? My life was actively, presently imploding. I was pregnant. I was trapped. I was facing total ruin. The gesture felt absurd, nonsensical, like being handed a feather in the middle of a hurricane. A flicker of frustrated anger went through me. It was useless. I didn't open the box. I didn't even touch it. I turned and walked away, leaving it in the shadows of the forgotten corner of the library. I left feeling just as hopeless, just as lost as I had been before. But as I walked out into the cold afternoon air, her words echoed in my mind. The town's memory is longer than people think. The cryptic phrase, the quiet solidarity in her eyes, it was something. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a rescue. It was just a whisper in a world that had become deafeningly silent. It was a key to a door I didn't know existed, a seed planted in the scorched earth of my soul. I didn't understand it, but I knew somehow that I would never forget it. The plan was unveiled on a Sunday night in the strained, artificial calm that had become our new reality. It was my mother who spoke, her voice carefully devoid of emotion, as if she were reading a grocery list. My father sat beside her at the kitchen table, staring at his gnarled hands, a statue of defeat. I stood by the counter, a ghost in my own home. My pregnancy was no longer a secret we could hide with baggy sweaters. Time was a rapidly shrinking commodity. "Your Aunt Carol has agreed to let you stay with her in California," my mother began, her eyes fixed on a point on the wall just over my shoulder. Carol was my mother's distant cousin, a name from Christmas cards, a woman I hadn't seen since I was 6. "It's quiet there. No one knows you. You'll be comfortable. We'll tell everyone here that you were accepted into a special advanced studies program at a private school near San Francisco," my father added, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "A prestigious opportunity. For the gifted." The word gifted hung in the air, a bitter, ironic echo of a life that was now a fantasy. The lie was not for me. It was for them. It was a flimsy shield to hold up against the pity and suspicion of the town. They laid it all out. I would leave at the end of the week. I would stay in California until the baby was born. And then, their voices faltered. The unspoken part of the plan was the loudest. The baby would be given up. A closed adoption, a clean break, a secret buried 1,000 miles away. I listened, my body numb, my mind strangely calm. The fight had been drained out of me weeks ago in Principal Finch's office. This was not a negotiation. This was the logistics of my disappearance, the carrying out of a sentence that had already been passed. My own parents were now the wardens of my exile. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply nodded. My compliance was the most heartbreaking sound in the room. The next few days were a blur of erasure. I packed a single suitcase. The college pennants on my wall seemed to mock me. I took them down, leaving faded rectangles on the wallpaper. I packed away the ambitious, hopeful girl I used to be, folding her up alongside sweaters and jeans. My friends called the house, but my mother would tell them I was sick, that I couldn't come to the phone. I was already becoming a ghost. The departure was a thief's exit. We left before dawn on a Friday, the sky a starless, inky black. The streets of Harmony Creek were asleep, unaware that one of their own was being spirited away. My father drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his jaw set. My mother sat in the back with me, her hand resting on my knee, a silent, desperate point of contact. At the bus station in the next town over, under the buzzing fluorescent lights, the finality of it all crashed down. My mother hugged me, a fierce, trembling embrace, her tears hot on my cheek. "Be safe," she whispered, the words thick with all the things she couldn't say. My father hugged me awkwardly, his large body stiff with unspoken shame and sorrow. He pressed a thick envelope of cash into my hand. "For emergencies," he mumbled, unable to meet my eyes. Then I was walking up the steps of the bus, finding a seat by a grimy window. I watched them as the bus pulled away. 2 lonely figures standing under a flickering light, growing smaller and smaller until they were swallowed by the darkness. I did not cry. I felt hollowed out, a vessel emptied of everything that had ever mattered. The bus carried me south, and the landscape of my life changed. The familiar damp pines of Oregon gave way to the dry, golden hills of California. It was a journey into a foreign land. Aunt Carol lived in a sun-bleached suburb east of Los Angeles, a place of identical stucco houses and relentlessly cheerful sunshine. She was a thin, nervous woman who was not unkind, but who treated me with the cautious distance one might afford a dangerous, unpredictable animal. I was her family duty, her secret burden. My existence was confined to her small, tidy house. I read. I watched television. I felt the baby grow inside me, a constant living reminder of the life I had lost and the future I couldn't imagine. The months passed in a slow, suffocating rhythm. I was no one, from nowhere. The end came in a sterile, white hospital where I knew no one. The labor was a lonely, terrifying ordeal. My only companions, the detached, professional faces of nurses who came and went. I was just another patient, another problem to be processed. And then, in the exhausted, surreal quiet of the recovery room, they placed her in my arms. The moment I saw her, the world, which had been gray and muffled for so long, exploded into color. She was so tiny, so perfect, her face impossibly small, her eyes squeezed shut. A little tuft of dark, silky hair, just like mine, crowned her head. A wave of love so fierce, so absolute, it felt like a physical blow surged through me. It was the first pure, true thing I had felt in nearly a year. This was not a secret. This was not a sickness. This was my daughter. I named her Chloe. For 3 hours, she was mine. I held her against my chest, her tiny body a warm, solid weight. I studied every detail of her face, the curve of her cheek, the perfect shell of her ear, the way her tiny fingers curled around mine. I memorized the unique, sweet scent of her skin. I whispered all the things to her I would never get to say again, that I loved her, that I was sorry, that I hoped her life would be beautiful. I was trying to pour a lifetime of motherhood into a handful of moments. Then the door opened, and a nurse came in, her expression professionally gentle. "It's time," she said softly. Time. The word was a death sentence. I looked down at Chloe, asleep in my arms, and a sob, a raw, animal sound of pure agony, was ripped from my soul. I didn't want to let her go. My body, my very being, rebelled against it. But I had no choice. The papers had been signed. The decision had been made in a quiet kitchen 1,000 miles and a lifetime ago. The nurse, gently, inexorably, lifted my daughter from my arms. The loss of her weight was a sudden, violent amputation. My arms felt instantly, terribly empty. I watched as she was carried out of the room, a small, precious bundle. I heard her begin to cry, a thin, searching wail that faded down the long, sterile hallway until it was gone. And then there was only silence. I lay alone in the starched white hospital bed. The pregnancy was over. The physical evidence of my secret was gone. But I was not free. I had been hollowed out, carved into a new shape by a new, more permanent wound. The road to exile hadn't just led me away from home. It had led me to her, and then it had torn her away, leaving a hole in my universe in the shape of a child I would never know. And in that silent, empty room, the ghost of the girl who had once been Lily Hayes finally faded away completely, replaced by the quiet, permanent sorrow of a mother whose life had been defined, forever, by a loss that had no name. Decades are thieves. They move silently, taking not just your youth and your strength, but the very shape of the world you knew, leaving you a stranger in your own history. For 53 years I lived as that stranger. After California, I did not go back. I couldn't. I moved to a city in the Midwest, a place with harsh winters and flat landscapes, a place as far from the damp pines of Oregon and the merciless sun of California as I could get. I did not achieve my Ivy League dreams. The ambition that had once burned so brightly had been extinguished, leaving behind only the cold ash of survival. I took a simple administrative job at a small manufacturing company and worked there for 40 years. I was reliable, quiet, and efficient. No one knew my story. I lived in a small, neat apartment, read books from the library, and never married. How could I build a life with someone when my own foundation was a sinkhole of secrets? I had no other children. Chloe was a singular, sacred wound, a ghost in my heart that I could never share. I did not live. I existed. I waited. For what? I never knew. Then the call came. My father first, a sudden heart attack at the mill. My mother, adrift without her anchor, faded slowly over the next 2 years, finally succumbing to a quiet, weary pneumonia. I returned for their funerals, brief, painful trips where I felt like an actress playing the part of a grieving daughter. After the second, there was no more avoiding it. The house, the estate, the final threads of my old life had to be dealt with. And so, at the age of 70, I packed a bag, locked the door to my quiet apartment, and drove west, back to the place where my life had truly ended. Driving back into Harmony Creek was like voluntarily stepping into my own tomb. The town looked smaller, the mountains that cradled it less majestic, more claustrophobic. The giant oak tree in the center of the town square was thicker, its branches lower and more gnarled, like an old man stooping. But the colonial-style storefronts were the same. Miller's Diner was still there, and the air still carried that familiar scent of pine and damp earth. It was the scent of my own destruction. Their house, I could no longer think of it as mine, was filled with the dust of a life concluded. Settling the estate was a slow, methodical process that forced me out into the town. I had to go to the bank on Main Street, the post office, the county records office for deeds and titles. I became a new, quiet fixture, the unknown old woman with the silver hair and the sad, watchful eyes. People were polite in that small-town way, holding doors and offering soft smiles, but no one recognized me. The bright, ambitious star pupil had been so completely erased that not even her ghost was familiar. I was an anonymous presence, walking the streets of my own personal battlefield, and it suited me. I didn't want to be seen. I wanted to see. My daily walks became a quiet, torturous pilgrimage. I would deliberately pass the high school, a brick monolith that held the most painful moments of my life within its silent walls, and I would walk through the town park. It had been renamed. A large, polished granite sign stood at the entrance, its bronze letters gleaming in the sun. Alistair Finch Memorial Park. I stood before it, my hand resting on the cold granite. Inside, children shrieked with laughter on the swings he had likely dedicated. Young mothers pushed strollers along the pristine paths. They had named a place of joy and innocence after the man who had calmly, methodically threatened to annihilate a pregnant, terrified teenage girl. He had died a hero, his legacy literally set in stone, a testament to his civic virtue. The irony was a physical sickness in my stomach. One Tuesday, while sitting on a bench across from the post office, I saw him. Marcus Thorne. He was stooped now, his movement slow as he got out of a pristine luxury sedan. His hair was thin and white, but he still carried himself with a shadow of his old, commanding presence. A younger man, handsome and beaming, held the door for him. People on the street nodded as he passed, their faces filled with a reverence that time had only deepened. The town's beloved Mr. Thorne. I watched him disappear into the bank, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. He looked like any other successful, revered old man, enjoying the fruits of a long, celebrated life. There was no sign of the monster, no hint of the rot that I knew lay beneath the surface. The world had rewarded him for his sins. His son's face was everywhere. Daniel Thorne for mayor. The campaign signs were planted in the neat lawns of half the houses in town, his handsome, trustworthy face smiling out from posters in shop windows. He had his father's charisma, but his smile seemed genuine, his eyes clear. The signs proclaimed his platform: community, integrity. Family values. Family values. The phrase was a dagger twisting in my oldest wound. This man, this handsome, successful lawyer, was the product of my erasure. His comfortable life, his political ambition, his entire identity as the proud son of a town hero was built upon the foundations of my silenced trauma and my lost child. He was the living, breathing legacy of his father's lie. My quiet sorrow, the grief I had carried like a shroud for 53 years, began to curdle into something else. It was a cold, quiet anger, the kind that does not burn hot, but freezes, hardening the soul. The injustice of it was staggering. It wasn't just that they had gotten away with it. It was that they had triumphed. They had written the history, carved it in stone, and named parks after it. In their version of the story, I didn't even exist. That evening, I was in the attic of my parents' house, sorting through boxes, the air thick with the smell of dust and time. I came across a small chest filled with my old things, my high school letterman jacket, a debate team trophy, a stack of old report cards, a cascade of perfect A's, relics from the life of a girl who was now a complete stranger to me. At the bottom of the box was my copy of the senior yearbook. I opened it. There he was. Mr. Marcus Thorne, faculty advisor, Harmony Herald. His picture was handsome, his smile confident. Underneath, a quote, "The truth will set you free." I closed the book, a bitter laugh catching in my throat. I sat there in the dusty attic, holding the artifacts of my stolen past, the smiling face of my destroyer staring up at me. Through the small attic window, I could see the neighbor's lawn across the street. A Daniel Thorne for Mayor sign stood planted in the grass, its message of integrity a bold, defiant lie in the twilight. The ghost who had returned to Harmony Creek to settle an estate and quietly fade away was gone. A new purpose was beginning to form. They had buried the truth, but they had forgotten about the one person left who knew where the body was, and she was finally ready to start digging. That night, sleep was a distant country. I sat in my parents' dusty armchair, the yearbook open on my lap, the smiling face of Marcus Thorne a grotesque mask. The cold, quiet anger that had been solidifying in my chest now had a sharp edge. For 53 years, my trauma had been a shapeless, formless ghost. Now it had a face, a name, and a political campaign built on lies. But what could I do? I was one old woman, a ghost myself, against a town's cherished history. And then, a memory, faint as a whisper, surfaced from the deep well of the past. Mrs. Reed, the library, the dusty box. The cryptic words. The town's memory is longer than people think. I had dismissed it then, a strange gesture from a strange old woman. I was a drowning girl, and she had handed me a book of matches. But now, decades later, the thought returned with an electric jolt. What had she been trying to tell me? My parents had saved everything. Every report card, every photograph, every meaningless trinket. Was it possible? The thought was a wild, desperate hope. The next morning, I began my search. I started in the attic, the place where the past was stored and left to decay. I moved boxes of old Christmas decorations, stacks of my father's tax records, my mother's sewing patterns, and then I saw it, tucked away in a corner, covered in a half-century of dust. A brown cardboard archive box. My heart hammered against my ribs. On the side, in faded marker, were the words I remembered. Harmony Herald Archives, 1955, 1965. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. It seemed Mrs. Reed, in her quiet, persistent way, must have ensured the box found its way to my parents after I vanished. Inside, the old school newspapers were brittle and yellowed, smelling of time itself. Lying right on top was a sealed, cream-colored envelope. In elegant, spidery cursive was my name. Lily Hayes. My breath caught. It was a letter from a ghost, a message sent across a 50-year abyss. With shaking fingers, I broke the seal. The paper inside was thin and fragile. Lily, if you are reading this, it means you have come back, and you are finally ready to look. I always hoped you would. The past is never as neat as they make it seem. They bury the things they don't want to remember, but the earth is never as deep as they think. Don't just look for your own story. Look for the echoes. Check the transfer records against the school board minutes. And remember, Finch was a young teacher once too. Be careful. Read. I read the note 3 times, the words imprinting themselves on my mind. It was a roadmap. A set of instructions from my only ally. The quiet librarian had seen more than just my tears. She had seen the whole rotten structure, and she had left me the blueprint to its foundations. My grief and my anger now had a purpose. I became a woman possessed by a singular, cold mission. I started with the newspapers, spreading them out on the dining room table, the past laid bare in black and white. I scanned the columns, the smiling faces of students from another era. And then I found her. A small article from the spring of 1978, a few years after Thorne's arrival. A photo of a pretty, dark-haired girl with a hopeful smile. Junior Sarah Jane Miller transfers to East Coast School. The article was brief. A sudden family health emergency. Everyone wished her the best. It was an echo of my own disappearance. A quiet, neat erasure. One thread. The next step was the county records office, a hushed, solemn building downtown. I spent days there, my new life's work, my quiet, meticulous nature, honed by 40 years of administrative solitude, was now my greatest asset. I requested the Harmony Creek School Board minutes for 1978. As expected, Sarah Jane's transfer was approved in a single-line item, no discussion, no details, another neat burial. Then I followed the second part of Mrs. Reed's directive. Finch was a young teacher once, too. This was the real leap of faith. I had to find out where he had come from before Harmony Creek. It took 2 days of scrolling through microfiche of old regional newspapers, but I found it. A small article from 1968 announcing his appointment as the new principal of Harmony Creek High. It mentioned his previous position as a history teacher at Northwood District High School, 2 counties over. My heart was pounding as I filed the request for the Northwood District School Board archives from 1958 to 1962. The clerk looked at me, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes, but she dutifully retrieved the heavy bound ledgers. I sat at a dusty table and began to read. For hours, it was a tedious chronicle of budgets and building maintenance. And then I found it. November 1960. The minutes noted the board had entered a closed session to discuss a sensitive personnel matter. The minutes for the session itself were sealed. My heart sank. A dead end. But I kept reading. 3 months later, February 1961. In the financial ledger appendix, a single sterile line item under extraordinary disbursements. Settlement, J. Doe v. School District, re-personnel matter, A. Finch. I stared at the entry, my vision blurring. A settlement, a payout. A secret, buried so deep it was recorded only as a ghost of a transaction. A young girl identified only as Jane Doe had made an accusation against her young teacher, Alistair Finch, and the school had paid to make it go away. The pieces of the last 50 years slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. I leaned back in the hard wooden chair, the air driven from my lungs. Finch's office. His unnerving, reptilian calm, the flash of cold fury in his eyes, his immediate, absolute defense of Thorne. His venomous threat to destroy me. It was never about protecting the school's reputation. It was never about his loyalty to a decorated educator. It was about him. Thorne, in his cunning, must have discovered Finch's dirty little secret. It was the perfect leverage, the perfect insurance policy. Protect me, or I expose you. They weren't colleagues. They were co-conspirators bound together by a pact of mutual dirty secrets. When I walked into Finch's office, a pregnant, terrified girl, I wasn't just a threat to Marcus Thorne. I was a lit match in a room filled with gasoline, threatening to ignite a fire that would consume them both. Finch's verdict wasn't an act of institutional protection. It was the desperate, vicious act of a guilty man bearing the evidence to save himself. I looked down at the faded ink in the ledger. This single line item was the truth. The real truth. It wasn't just my story against theirs anymore. It was a history of predation and a conspiracy of silence, stretching back decades. Mrs. Reed hadn't just given me solidarity, she had given me a weapon. A legacy of truth, sharp and cold and ready to be wielded. The anger in my chest was no longer a fire, it was ice. It was clear. It was focused. And for the first time in a very, very long time, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I walked out of the county records office into the bright afternoon sun. The world irrevocably changed. In my handbag, a folded, flimsy photocopy felt as heavy and as powerful as a slab of granite. It was the truth, a Rosetta Stone for my own life, translating 50 years of pain into a single damning word, conspiracy. I saw it everywhere now. The cheerful green sign for Alistair Finch Memorial Park was no longer just an irony. It was an accomplice. The respectful nods given to Marcus Thorne on the street were not just misguided. They were the actions of a duped populace. and the smiling, handsome face of Daniel Thorne on his campaign posters was no longer just the face of a political candidate. It was the face of a fraudulent dynasty. My first instinct was primal. I wanted to take the photocopy, drive to Marcus Thorne's pristine home, and shove it in his face. I wanted to watch his revered, elderly facade crumble. I wanted to see the monster I knew was there surface in his eyes one last time. I played the scene out in my mind as I sat on a bench, watching the life of the town flow around me. I would accuse him. He would deny it, his voice full of manufactured outrage. Perhaps his wife Eleanor would call the police. It would become a messy, undignified spectacle. A crazy old woman's word against a beloved town hero. Even with the proof about Finch, it would be convoluted, a story from decades ago. Some would believe me. Many would not. They would see me as a vindictive, confused old woman trying to tarnish a good man's name in his final years, and Thorne would die, perhaps disgraced in the eyes of some, but the core of his legacy, the reverence, the respect, the power his name held in this town, might survive, wounded but intact. And it wasn't enough. Justice, I realized with a chilling clarity, was not about watching him squirm. Justice was not about a messy, private confrontation. Justice was about undoing what he had done. He had not just stolen my body and my child, he had stolen my story, erased my truth, and in its place, he had built a monument to himself, a monument of lies. To punish the man was temporary, to destroy the monument, to salt the earth where it stood so that nothing could ever grow there again. That would be justice. And the monument, the living, breathing legacy of Marcus Thorne, was his son. Daniel. His entire life was the inheritance. He had grown up with the privilege and respect that came with being the son of Harmony Creek's most admired educator. His law career, his social standing, his confident run for mayor, all of it was predicated on the bedrock of his father's good name. The integrity he preached was not his own. It was a borrowed, fraudulent garment handed down from a father whose true nature was a monstrous secret. My focus shifted. My target became clear. Exposing Marcus Thorne was a small, petty revenge. Dismantling his son's inheritance piece by piece, in the full light of the public square, that was a reckoning. My days took on a new, sharp purpose. I was no longer a ghost aimlessly haunting the scenes of a crime. I was a strategist gathering intelligence. I started attending Daniel Thorne's campaign events. I sat in the back of a coffee meet and greet at Miller's Diner, a quiet old woman sipping water, watching him work the room. He was good. He was charming and earnest, listening to people's concerns about property taxes and the leaky roof at the town library with genuine interest. He shook hands, remembered names, and smiled his father's winning smile. Then he began to speak to the small crowd, and he used the weapon his father had given him. "My father, Marcus Thorne," he began, his voice warm with affection, "taught me that integrity isn't about what you do when people are watching. It's about who you are when you're alone." He built his life on that principle, on educating and uplifting the people of this town, and that's the legacy I want to bring to the mayor's office. The words were a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs. He was using anecdotes of his father's wisdom as campaign cornerstones, completely unaware that each story was another brick in a fraudulent facade. He was campaigning on the myth that had ruined my life. I watched him, and for the first time, I felt a sliver of something other than cold rage. There was a tragic pity. He was, most likely, an innocent man who had spent his entire life benefiting from a terrible crime. He was the inheritor of a poisoned estate, and I was the executor of the will. I learned his schedule. I discovered he held a public town hall at the end of each month in the high school auditorium. A QA session, a forum for any citizen to stand up and ask a question. The irony was exquisite. The stage where he would perform his pitch for the future would become the courtroom where I would expose the past. The high school, the very institution that had betrayed and exiled me, would be the site of its own reckoning. My plan solidified. It would not be a screaming accusation. It would be a story. It would be calm. It would be precise. I wouldn't need to wave my evidence or name my abuser. I would simply present the pattern. I would tell the story of a forgotten girl, and then the story of another forgotten girl, and then I would ask a question about a long-forgotten settlement in another town. I would hand the thread to the public, to the local press who always attended these events, and let them pull it. The week before the next town hall, I stood across the street from Daniel Thorne's campaign headquarters. A huge banner hung above the door, his smiling face printed next to the words, "Harmony Creek's future, a legacy of trust." A legacy of trust. I looked down at my hands. They were old, spotted with age, but they were steady. The ghost of Main Street now had a voice, a plan, and a truth that had waited 50 years to be told. The son's inheritance was built on a lie. And I was coming to collect the debt. The auditorium at Harmony Creek High was a place I had not set foot in for 53 years. The last time I had been here, I was on this very stage, receiving a medal for academic excellence. Tonight, the stage was bathed in bright professional lights, adorned with red, white, and blue banners bearing the handsome, smiling face of Daniel Thorne. The room was packed, buzzing with the cheerful, optimistic energy of a town ready to embrace its own bright future. I sat in the back, near the exit, a small, gray-haired woman in a simple dark coat. I was invisible, just another anonymous face in the crowd, and I drew a strange strength from it. My heart, which I had expected to be pounding, beat with a slow, steady, and cold rhythm. The anxious, terrified girl was long gone. The sorrowful ghost had served her purpose. The woman who sat in the auditorium that night was someone else entirely, a vessel for a story that had waited half a century to be told. Daniel Thorne was magnificent. He strode onto the stage to thunderous applause, the golden son of a golden father. He was a natural, his speech flowing with an easy, confident charisma. He spoke of progress, of community, of bringing Harmony Creek into a new era while honoring its traditions. And then he played his final, fateful card. I learned the most important lessons about public service right here in this town. From a man many of you knew, he said, his voice resonating with genuine warmth. My father, Marcus Thorne, taught me that a community is only as strong as its commitment to its children, to their futures. He believed in integrity above all else. That is his legacy, and that is the legacy I promise to uphold as your mayor. A wave of applause washed over the room. I remained perfectly still, my hands resting in my lap. He was serving me my own opening remarks. After his speech, the floor was opened for the Q&A. The house lights came up. Hands went up across the auditorium. A man from the Merchants Association asked about downtown parking. A young mother asked about funding for the elementary school. Daniel answered each question with grace and a well-rehearsed command of the facts. The atmosphere was one of comfortable, predictable civic discourse. Then there was a lull. I took a deep, slow breath and stood up. My movement was small, but it seemed to draw a current of attention in the room. I walked slowly, deliberately, down the side aisle toward the microphone stand placed in the center. The sound of my sensible shoes on the floor seemed unnaturally loud in the vast space. Heads turned. People craned their necks to see who this unknown old woman was. I felt their collective gaze, but it held no power over me anymore. I reached the microphone and adjusted its height, my movements unhurried. I looked out, not at Daniel Thorne on the stage, but at the faces in the crowd, my neighbors, the children and grandchildren of the people who had known me. Daniel smiled at me from the stage, a patient, encouraging look. Yes, ma'am, the floor is yours. I leaned in, and my voice, clear and steady, filled the auditorium. It was not the voice of a ghost. It was the voice of a historian. I don't have a question, Mr. Thorne, I began, but I would like to tell a story. It's an old story about a girl who used to live here. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. On the stage, Daniel's smile faltered slightly, replaced by a look of polite curiosity. This girl, I continued, my eyes scanning the faces before me, was 17. She was the star pupil of this very high school. She was bright and ambitious, and she dreamed of leaving this town for a great university. She had a mentor, a brilliant, charismatic teacher everyone admired, a man who made her feel seen, who promised to help her build her future. The auditorium grew quiet. I could see Daniel on the stage, his posture shifting slightly, a flicker of unease crossing his face. This teacher used his position, his charm, and her trust to groom her. And in an empty classroom after school, he stole what was left of her childhood. And when this girl, this child, discovered she was pregnant with his baby, she was terrified. A collective gasp went through the room. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. Every person was frozen, locked onto my story. She went to her teacher for help, I said, my voice unwavering, and he called her a liar. He told her she would ruin his life, so she went to the only other person she thought could help her. The principal of this school, a powerful, respected man, and in his office, that principal did not offer her comfort. He threatened her. He told her if she ever spoke of it, he would have her expelled and would personally see to it that her future was destroyed, writing to every college to inform them of her moral instability. I paused, letting the horror of the words sink into the silent room. I glanced at the stage. Daniel Thorne's face was ashen. The confident politician was gone, replaced by a man staring at a ghost, his mind visibly, frantically trying to connect the terrible, familiar-sounding dots. So the girl's family, seeing no other choice, sent her away in secret to have the baby, which was given up for adoption. Her disappearance was explained away as a transfer to a prestigious school. She was erased. Her story was buried. I took a breath, my voice dropping slightly, becoming sharper. I was curious, as an old woman with time on her hands, so I started looking through old town records, and I found a story about another girl a few years later, a promising student who also had to transfer abruptly for health reasons. Another quiet erasure. And then, I said, my gaze finally lifting to lock directly with Daniel Thorne's. I looked even further back, into the history of other schools, in other districts. It's amazing what you can find in the public record, in the appendices of old school board budgets, if you just know where to look. He understood. I saw the moment of comprehension, the final, devastating click of the puzzle pieces falling into place. It wasn't just his father. It was Finch. It was a conspiracy. His entire world, his entire understanding of his own life was collapsing in real time on a brightly lit stage in front of everyone he had ever known. I let the silence stretch for a beat, and then I delivered the final line. A town's legacy, I said, my voice resonating with the weight of 53 years, is only as strong as the secrets it keeps. I placed the head of the microphone carefully back into its stand. I turned away from the stage, away from the shattered man, away from the hundreds of horrified, staring faces. I walked back up the aisle, my steps even and measured. The crowd parted from me as if I were carrying a disease or a holy fire. I pushed open the heavy double doors at the back of the auditorium and stepped out into the cool night air. I did not look back. I had delivered my confession. I had detonated the bomb of the truth in the heart of their comfortable, well-kept lies. The fallout was theirs to live with now. My work was done. I did not stay to watch the fire spread. I walked home through the cool, quiet streets of Harmony Creek, each step lighter than the last. For the first time in 53 years, the secret was not inside me. It was loose in the world, a living thing, and it was no longer my burden to carry alone. I went home, made myself a cup of tea, and for the first time since I was 17 years old, I slept through the night. The echo of my confession began as a tremor and grew into an earthquake. The first article, written by a sharp-eyed state political reporter who had come for a fluff piece on an up-and-coming mayor, appeared 2 days later. It was cautious, describing the shocking and unsubstantiated story told by an unidentified elderly woman that had abruptly ended the town hall. It described Daniel Thorne's ashen face and his immediate cancellation of all future campaign events. But Lily Hayes was no longer an unidentified woman. The reporter, following the breadcrumbs I had left, began to dig. She found the record of my birth, my school transcripts, the abrupt end of my time at Harmony Creek High. Then she found the echo, the newspaper clipping about Sarah Jane Miller's sudden transfer. And finally, with the help of her paper's legal team, she unearthed the ghost in the machine. The record of the financial settlement in the Northwood district, connecting a Jane Doe complaint to a young teacher named Alistair Finch. The follow-up story was front-page news across the state. Conspiracy of silence, Harmony Creek leaders implicated in decades-old abuse scandal. The story was no longer just mine. It was a carefully documented account of a pattern of predation and a corrupt pact of self-preservation. The truth, once spoken aloud, had a ferocious power all its own. Harmony Creek fractured. The initial reaction was defensive shock. People who had known and loved Marcus Thorne for generations refused to believe it. But the evidence was undeniable. The story of Sarah Jane Miller, now a grandmother in Arizona, came out. She had never told anyone, having been shamed into silence by her own family. The town was forced to look at its heroes and see only monsters. The sign for the Alistair Finch Memorial Park was quietly taken down by a town work crew in the dead of night. The name itself had become an obscenity. Daniel Thorne withdrew from the mayoral race and public life entirely. He issued a single, written statement expressing his profound horror, his deep apology to all his father's victims, and his own shattering disillusionment. I read that he and his wife sold their house and moved away, his inheritance of integrity replaced by a legacy of public shame he would carry for the rest of his life. Marcus Thorne was besieged. Reporters camped outside his house. The reverence of the town turned to revulsion. He died 6 months later, not from a dramatic confrontation, but from the quiet, suffocating weight of his own exposed sins. A prisoner in the beautiful home his silence had bought him. I watched it all from a distance, a quiet observer of the storm I had unleashed. I felt no triumph, no thrill of victory. Revenge, I had come to understand, was a hollow meal. What I felt instead was a strange, quiet peace. The truth was finally where it belonged, in the light. The ghost of Lily Hayes, the star pupil, had finally been given a proper burial. Then, one afternoon in late autumn, a letter arrived. It was in a simple white envelope with a return address in Seattle I didn't recognize. My name was written on the front in a neat, unfamiliar hand. I opened it with a strange sense of calm, as if I had been waiting for it my whole life. The letter was from a woman named Chloe. "Dear Ms. Hayes," it began, the words careful and hesitant. "My name is Chloe Benson. I am 53 years old. I am writing to you on what I know is a complete long shot. I was adopted as a newborn in California. The adoption was closed, but I was given non-identifying information, including the date and hospital of my birth. I have been on the National Adoption Registry for years, with no results. Recently, a friend sent me a news story from the Oregonian. It was about you and about events that took place in a town called Harmony Creek a long time ago. Your name was mentioned, as was your age, and the timeline of the story you told. It aligns with the time of my own birth. Something about reading it, about the courage it must have taken for you to speak, resonated so deeply with me that I felt I had to reach out. I don't know what I'm asking. I suppose I am just asking if my story and your story might be connected. If not, I am so sorry to have bothered you. But if they are..." She left the sentence unfinished. She had signed it, and below her name was a phone number. I held the letter in my hands, my fingers tracing the shape of her name, my daughter's name. Chloe. The empty space in my life, the wound I had carried for a lifetime, now had a voice. It had a neat handwriting and lived in Seattle. It had taken a public reckoning to make possible a private reunion. The trauma could never be erased, but for the first time, a new path, a path toward knowing, a path toward healing, had opened before me. I looked out the window of my parents' house. It was just a house now, in a town that was learning to live with its own scarred history. They didn't silence me all those years ago. They just gave my voice time to age, to strengthen, to find its moment. And when I finally spoke, it was loud enough to tear down walls. Vengeance was never the point. The point was the truth. It was the only thing I had left, the only thing that was truly mine. And the truth, I finally come to understand, has its own kind of family. It creates connections you never thought possible. It reaches across decades and finds you, and sometimes it even writes you a letter asking to come home.